We're going to be in John chapter 11 this evening. I would like to remind you that last week we began this journey through John chapter 11, walking through this very dense and packed and action-filled chapter in the Gospel of John. This particular chapter deals with the raising of Lazarus and Jesus stepping onto the scene. Here in the fourth gospel, we saw last week as we began this time of Bible study and kind of introduced this particular series that's going to take several weeks to walk through all there is to see in chapter 11. We looked briefly at the 7 signs in the Gospel of John. There are 7 major signs, 7 big moments in the Gospel of John when Jesus reveals the glory of God. And signs, we saw last week, are important, but we must not get bogged down in the sign itself. We must always remember the purpose of a sign. A sign is a description that points to a greater reality. A sign is not always, it's not just about itself. It always points to something that is greater. Now, I hope you remember from last week, the illustration about understanding signs that we used were the signs that are on our property that say Viewmont Baptist Church. You remember this from last week? Viewmont Baptist Church. You see that sign out on 127 that says Viewmont Baptist Church, and you know that the sign itself is not Viewmont Baptist Church, right? Even though the sign says Viewmont Baptist, it's not Viewmont Baptist itself. It points you to, it lets you know that you have arrived at Viewmont Baptist Church. You look up from the road and you see a structure of brick and mortar with a steeple that reaches up toward the heavens. There again, you say, there is Viewmont Baptist Church, but the building we know is not the church, right? You are the church. We are the church. And so the sign always points to the greater reality that exists. And signs are important because signs let us know where we are going. Signs let us know where we have come and where we now stand. And the same is true for the 7 signs that are in the Gospel of John. They are indicators of what God is doing. They are in and of themselves miraculous moments in the ministry of Jesus, yes, but they are always pointing to something beyond that present moment. What they are doing is they are revealing the glory of God. Remember in John 1:14, the Word was made flesh and made its dwelling among us, and we have gazed upon His glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth. John, the gospel writer, is intentional in every way, at every turn. Every detail that's in the Gospel of John is there on purpose. And what John is doing is describing God made flesh, the Word becoming human and moving into the neighborhood, as the Message translation will say. I really like that. God became a human being and moved into the neighborhood. That's the incarnation. So in summary, from last week, I want you to remember that John chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, this is the 7th sign in the gospel. The 7th time there is a sign performed. John doesn't use the language of miracles. He doesn't describe these as miracles. He describes them as signs. That's important. It's very important to understand when you're reading John to remember the signs. This is the 7th one. This is the one that all the others seem to be building up to. If you read through John from chapter 1 all the way through, you can feel there is this momentum that's beginning. It is starting to snowball, and everything is starting to come to a head. And at the end of chapter 11, you see things really have come to a head. They've really come to a head for Jesus. They've really come to a head for the mission of God. This is the one that all the previous signs have been pointing to. It's the culmination of what's been building. I want you to look at John chapter 11, verses 14 and 15. This describes the purpose of all of this. What is the purpose of the sign, of all the signs? Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is not dead, and for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. The point of all the signs in the Gospel of John, from the turning of water into wine at the wedding at Cana, all the way through to John chapter 11 and the raising of Lazarus, they all have the same purpose, that you may believe. That you may believe what God is doing and who God has sent. Believe in the one God has sent. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to begin looking at John chapter 11 through a theological lens. I'm going to share some words with you that I shared with you last week that kind of set the tone for what we're going to do. I shared with you these words from the Reverend Dr. N.T. Wright in his magnificent book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. He writes, the story of the raising of Lazarus in John 11 is, of course, one of the most powerful narratives in the canonical portrayals of Jesus. That is, the descriptions we have in the written New Testament. Told with a constant eye on the deep human emotions embedded in the story, it is equally full of theological importance. Equally full of theological importance. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to start looking at the theological importance. What does this mean for our theology or our words about God? What does this mean? Now, we saw how true this is just last week, what Wright has to say, because there is deep human emotion involved in the story, in the raising of Lazarus. Is there not? There is weeping, there is mourning, there is lamenting, there is complaining, there is joy. There's a lot of human emotion involved, but there's also a theological significance here that we should not miss. I shared with you last week, if I had to come up with a really catchy phrase, a really catchy title to put on this sermon series, I think I would call it the seventh inning stretch. The seventh inning stretch. And you remember what the seventh inning stretch is, right? In a baseball game, it is that moment between the first half and the second half of the seventh inning. We sing, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," but everybody stands up, everybody stretches their legs, and everybody gets ready for the end of the game, right? And when you hear "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," you know that the end is coming and that a victor will soon be declared, right? The seventh inning stretch is a sign that the end is nigh. So we could say that this is the seventh inning stretch in the Gospel of John. This is the last moment to stop, stand up, stretch your legs, and get ready for the end of the game. We know it's almost over. Tonight we're going to focus on the theological emphasis of the chapter, at least in one portion of this. But I want to do a little bit more background with John 11, 1 through 16. Jesus gets word, just a summary of the text, Jesus gets word that his friend Lazarus is sick and is about to die. And then we learn Jesus decides to stay where he is another 2 days. He does not rush to the side of Lazarus. He stays where he is another 2 days. We pointed this out last week, but it bears repeating. We should take note at whatever Jesus does. When Jesus does something, it is always intentional. And when John records it, it's always intentional. We come across this idea of the hour in John's gospel. And the concept of time is really important in the Gospel of John. Jesus and John, as he writes kind of his narrative that gets Jesus from place to place, John will use this phrase about the hour, the time. Jesus will also use the same language, the hour or the time. What John and Jesus are referring to, the hour they are referring to, is the hour of suffering and death for Jesus. It's always pointing to the suffering moment of Jesus. The first time that the phrase is used is in John chapter 2, where Jesus is there. He's at a wedding in the village of Cana. They run out of wine. It's very embarrassing. And Jesus' mother, Mary, comes to him and says, they've run out of wine. And Jesus says, well, what do you want me to do about it? What do you want me to do? Don't bother me with this. My hour has not yet come. The hour has not arrived. And what he's saying is, it's not time yet to reveal the full glory of God. That hour is coming, but it's not here yet. New Testament scholar Frederick Dale Bruner talks about how Jesus' hour consistently suggests the great weekend of humiliation and exaltation. And the phrasing and the use of the hour, it comes up several more times in the Gospel of John. Several more times does either Jesus use it or John uses it. And it's always pointing to the passion, always pointing to the suffering of Jesus, that moment when he will cry out to Tetelestai, it is finished. It is complete. One of the aspects of Jesus that John points out so clearly, though, is the unity Jesus shares with the Father in the Holy Spirit. Over and over again, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. We are one in the same. And one of the ways John makes this clear is this use of the phrase about the hour. John is careful to say that the things that happened to Jesus and the people who wanted to take him down, they wanted to kill him, but somehow Jesus was able to evade that. Why? Because the hour had not yet arrived. The time had not yet come. It's almost as if the Father is not going to let anything happen until just the right moment. Paul will pick up on this in a different way when he writes to the Galatians, when he says that when the fullness of time had come, Jesus was born. When the time was right, Jesus was born. Now think about the power of time for a moment. It is remarkable and it is underappreciated. To think that time is in the hands of God, that's another remarkable thought. For God created time as we know it, the linear existence of time. And to think that God operates both within time and outside of time, God operates within temporality and eternity, that's remarkable. There is no stopping what God is able to do. And that what God has done in Jesus, God has wrapped himself in human flesh and stepped into time, into the confines of time. Jesus of Nazareth, though he is the creator of the entire universe, when the historical Jesus walked and talked and lived and breathed and ministered, all of that, he was in one place at one time. Think about that. One place at one time, just like you and me. God is doing something within time itself, but think about the hour, the cross. What happens on the cross happens within time, but it affects all of eternity, doesn't it? That moment when Jesus cries out, it is finished, that is not just a moment that shakes the fabric of time as we know it. That's a moment that shakes all of eternity, right? Don't we believe that? that the moment of the cross, it is the center of time and eternity, as Chambers will say. So when John tells us that Jesus stays for 2 more days where he is before coming to the side of Lazarus, we can hear these echoes of time in the background. Toward the end of John 10, we find that there are some Jewish leaders who are really upset with Jesus. And they are plotting to kill him. But he slips away. He slips away because the time is not right. It's not yet arrived. In John chapter 11, Jesus eventually does decide it's time to go to Bethany. The moment has arrived. It must have been a pretty short distance from where Jesus was to the village of Bethany. But the disciples don't want Jesus to go there. Remember, they tell him, they say, don't go. There's a crowd there who's waiting to kill you. They're waiting to take you in. But Jesus is going to plunge headlong into this. Why? Because the hour has come. The time has arrived. Jesus knows what is happening, and he's going to plunge headlong into this moment. Look at John 12, verse 23. John 12, 23. Jesus says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. The hour has now come. This is the first time Jesus has said this. The hour has not yet arrived. So what has taken place that leads up to this? It's the events in the village of Bethany. It's the raising of Lazarus from the dead. So the theological aspects of what's happening here in John 11 are startling. And if you read through the Gospel of John, again, you read through it from John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. You start there. By the time you get to chapter 11, you can feel the momentum is really building. You can feel there's something happening, and there's a big shift that's about to take place. And in John 11, we see things coming to a head, and we can sense the hour is coming. The hour is here. Let's pick up and read in John chapter 11. We're going to read verses 17 through 27. On his arrival, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and to Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, oh, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was come into the world. You remember hearing last week just how intentional all the details in John's Gospel are? I think the illustration that I used was about Shakespeare and how late in his career and his writing, everything was intentional. Every little piece in every Shakespearean play, sonnet, poem, writing, whatever, by the end of his career, it was all intentional. Every detail. That's how John's Gospel is. Every detail is there intentionally, not by accident. It's by design. And this portion we've just read, these 10, 11 verses we've just read, drive home that point in a very clear way. Everything's there on purpose. Time, it's all over the place in the chapter. Not only did Jesus stay an additional 2 days before making the journey to Bethany, but there must have been a good bit of time to pass since Lazarus drew his last breath. Jesus and the disciples discover Lazarus has already been dead for 4 days. It was customary that one would be buried on the day of death, prepared for burial, and placed in the tomb on the day of death. New Testament scholar George Beasley Murray says that this points to the practice that Lazarus was buried on the day he died, given the fact that Jesus stays where he is for 2 days, and then by the time that they arrive in Bethany, he's already been in the tomb for 4. So by the time news had reached Jesus and the disciples, Lazarus likely was already gone. The illness had already taken him. Remember, nothing is by accident in the Gospel of John. Verse 17, hear this again. On his arrival, they found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. This word in verse 17 about Lazarus being dead and in the tomb for 4 days brings us to this nod to rabbinic theology, what the rabbis taught about death and what happened at the time of death. It was a very common rabbinic teaching in this part of the world and in this part of history, leading up to this moment, and then for a couple of centuries after, that upon death, the soul would hover over and around the body for 3 days. That preparations would be made, burial preparations would be made. The body would be wrapped in linens and stuffed with spices and that kind of thing. The face likely would have been left uncovered to watch. But the spirit, it was believed, would hover over the deceased for 3 days. And then on the 4th day, if there'd been no movement, if there'd been no talking, if there'd been no breathing for the last 4 days, we can assure that this individual is truly dead. And now we can proceed with burial. Now, how does this make sense? Why is it 3 days? Well, there are rabbinic teachings that reach even further back to just after this time period that state that the most intense time of mourning is the first 3 days after the moment of death. That's when it was believed that the soul would hover over the body and then depart on the 4th. So when John then says that he's been in the tomb for 4 days, what that says is it's all over. There's no chance. Nothing's going to happen except a move of God. There is no chance. The family would enter into this time of mourning feeling the sting of death very fresh and very real. By human terms, by human timing, Jesus is too late. So when John says he's been dead 4 days, that's a way of saying we thought Jesus missed this. We thought he was too late. Now, the first 7 days of grieving in Palestinian Judaism, in that culture in the first century, the first 7 days of grieving were known as the Shiva, or the sitting. The family prepared the body. The family would wrap the body in strips of linen, like we know about, and spices would be placed around the body and in those strips, leaving the face uncovered, likely uncovered, and then the family would go and would be checking on the body. The body would be placed inside a tomb. And the way burials took place in the first century in Jewish culture and Jewish life, families had a tomb. And it was a cave that was hollowed out, and there were shelves that lined the walls of the cave. And so when a body was then prepared for burial, the body would be placed on a shelf as it was wrapped. Then after 4 days, it would be finished and wrapping the face covering, and the body would remain there on that shelf for a year. And the decomposition would take place. The flesh would begin to decompose, and what's left at the end of a year is just the skeletal remains. The skeletal remains would then be gathered up and would be placed into an ossuary or a bone box. And then the bone box would be placed higher up on a shelf. So it was customary to have, you could have several bodies in one tomb at the same time for a family, several branches of the family tree. and you would have several ossuaries or several bone boxes of ancestors. Everybody's buried together. That was the practice. That's how this worked. And so what would happen is, as the family, in the first 3 to 4 days, as the family would go and was checking on the body, how did they know that, quote, the soul had left? How did they know the person was really dead? The face begins to turn color. You begin to see the decomposition taking place. And so that reaction, that moment, then let them know, okay, this individual is really dead. Now we know later when Jesus tells everybody, take away the stone, they say, don't do that. It stinks, right? It smells bad. Don't roll the stone away. That's because they thought it's after 4 days. The time has passed. Jesus is simply too late. The initial 7 days, the family would stay kind of close to home, would make these visits to the cemetery and check in and see what things were going on. But what would happen is the community would then be coming around, much like we do today. The community would show up, the community would bring food, the community would come and would visit and sit and mourn. And so probably what happened, since Bethany was so close to Jerusalem, a lot of people would have come from Jerusalem to visit with the family of Lazarus who knew him. It's only 2 miles away. New Testament scholar Craig Keener says that the 7 days, that 7-day period of grieving, probably originally related to the isolation period of corpse uncleanness, reaching back to Numbers chapter 13. And also 7 days of Roman mourning that would take place. So there was this Old Testament law in Numbers 19, about not messing with the dead body and the uncleanness and that kind of thing. So this 7-day period allows for this time of intense mourning. It also allows for this time of ceremonial cleansing. That explains why the people would have been there. That explains why there would have been a crowd around when Lazarus has died and Jesus finally shows up. People were there engaging in the burial customs of the day. But this learning that there were people around serves on more than one level for John. Yes, he is tipping his hat and he is nodding to the burial customs and practices of the day, but John is also saying there was a crowd there who saw what I'm about to tell you. There were witnesses there. Remember, John 1:14, the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us, and we have seen, we have borne witness to His glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth. So John is saying there were witnesses present. People saw this happen. There was a crowd there to pay their respects to Lazarus, but they didn't know they were about to see the glory of God revealed in a very powerful way. But I find it interesting that people are there, yes, with Mary and Martha, but they are most upset at who wasn't there. Did you catch it? They have all these people around, but who are they upset with? Who was not there? Jesus, where have you been? Where were you? There's complaint offered there, is there not? Have you ever said to the Lord, where were you? You ever said that? You ever said, where were you when I needed you? If you would have been here, Lord, then this wouldn't have happened, right? You ever said it? I have. It's a very honest prayer. This is complaint, but there's also faith involved. Because Martha doesn't leave it with just a complaint. I want you to notice what she says in verses 21 and 22. Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. There is complaint. You were not here, and you're in trouble for it. On the other hand, I have a deep faith that I know that God's going to do something. But God's going to move in this situation. When you take complaint and add faith to it, you end up with a lament. It's a lament. Complaint plus faith equals lament. Do you remember in the spring? I hope you remember back in the spring when we looked at the Psalms. We looked at a lot of Psalms over the course of the spring months, and we spent one Wednesday evening just on the Psalms of lament. And there are lots of Psalms of lament where the psalmist complains to God, "Oh Lord, how long will you let this go on? Oh Lord, where were you when I've needed you? Oh Lord, why is this continuing to happen?" Laments are complaints plus faith. They complain toward God with faith that God is the only one who can do something about that which I am complaining about. When we lament before God, we are coming to say, "Lord, this hurts, this is not right, but I know you are the only one who can do something about it. And this is the only place I can go." So Martha comes to Jesus with this lament, but it's a faith-filled lament. It is a complaint. "You were not here. Where were you? You were not here, but yet I know that God will move." This seems to be the nature of the words from Martha to Jesus. You're late. Where have you been? You could have kept all of this from happening. And so how long will this grief continue? But yet in the midst of it all, I have faith that God will do something. You see, death is so much more than slipping peacefully into immortality and paradise. The Scriptures are very clear that death is the enemy of God, that death is the antithesis of God's good creation, that it destroys and it decays what God has created and pronounced good. And in the intertestamental period, that time frame between the Old and the New Testaments, death becomes understood as this power of darkness. It is the antithesis of God's good creation. It could be said that death is seen as a victory of the enemy over what God has called good. Fleming Rutledge, Episcopal priest and preacher and writer, does a wonderful job of unpacking this in her massive book on the crucifixion and what death means and the power that's there, but yet the deeper power of God, even over death. Now, by this point in Jewish theology, it was well understood, it was well taught that on the last day, when time is no more and everything is all wrapped up, that God would raise the righteous dead from their graves and give new life and recreate the earth. The Pharisees taught that. That was a Pharisaic teaching about the resurrection of the dead. The other common first century Jewish sect that we hear about in the New Testament was the Sadducees. You hear about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? You ever heard those two terms? Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, when it comes to this theology of the resurrection of the dead on the last day, the Pharisees said, yes, there is a resurrection of the dead, of the righteous on the last day. The Sadducees said, no, there is no resurrection of the dead, and this life is all there is. And that's why they were so sad, you see. Right? Because you like that one, right? Yeah, pretty good. Okay, yeah. Martha believes the Pharisaic teaching that there is coming a day when God will make all things new. Isaiah speaks to it. The prophets speak to it. There is coming a day when God will make all things new. And the dead will be raised and resurrection will take hold. And she knows that that day is coming when time is no more. It's a word about the end. Martha knows deep in her heart and in her soul, and she holds to it, and even deeper, it holds to her. And she has this hope, yes, my brother will rise again at the end. I believe that life is coming when Yahweh returns to recreate through redemption and resurrection. As he says through Isaiah, "Behold, I am doing a new thing, and the old order is past." Isaiah picks up on that a couple of times, especially toward the end of Isaiah in what's known as the post-exilic writings, as God is restoring Israel and doing a new thing. And in the midst of all of this, when Martha says, "I know my brother will rise again at the end," Jesus then responds with one of the I am statements in the Gospel of John. There are 7 major I am statements, and there's about 7 absolute I am statements in the Gospel of John. Jesus will say, "I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd, I am the door, I am the way, the truth, and the life." Jesus says, "I am." Statements of being, this is who I am, and they are connected with the 7 signs. This is what I am doing to bring together the glory of God revealed. Jesus takes the faith of Martha. I want you to notice this. Jesus takes the faith of Martha, and when she says, "I know my brother will be raised at the end and be resurrected," Jesus takes that and he doesn't destroy it. He doesn't cheapen it. He doesn't rebuke her for that. It is quite the opposite of what Jesus does. Jesus looks at her, he takes it deeper. He makes it more rich, and he encourages her. Listen to these words. John 11:25 and 26. Jesus says back to her, when she says, "I know my brother will rise again in the resurrection at the last day," he says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die." We have to understand that this resurrection of the dead is something to which many Jews held. And by the way, it is deeply Christian. The rest of the New Testament speaks to this reality as well, of the resurrection of the dead on the last day. But it's a word of hope. And hope is always about the not yet. Hope is about that which has not yet arrived, but we know is coming. Hope is about what is to come. It is a firmness in the present moment, knowing that the future is secure, that tomorrow is taken care of. And Jesus takes that hope that is deeply embedded into the Jewish faith and into this family. Jesus takes it to a whole new level. He says, everything you've been hoping for is standing right in front of you. Everything you've been hoping for is standing right here. I am the embodiment of the future. I am that future event. I am the living moment of resurrection. I am, is what he's saying. I am, the only one who can do what it is that you are hoping to. I am the future brought into this present moment. That event that's way off in time, that you don't know when it will happen, I'm standing right here in front of you, and I am it. I am the end result. I am the end of the ball game, and this is your 7th inning stretch. I'm telling you now who is going to win, who is going to be victorious. Believe in me, and death will have no hold. If I can be pastoral with you for just a moment, every funeral that we've held here together as a church family since I have been your pastor, every single one, funeral, memorial service, each one of them opens with these words from Jesus. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, I don't know if you've picked up on it. Every funeral, every memorial service begins with these words. Why? What better place to begin than with the resurrection and the life? To be reminded that in Jesus there is hope. And it's a hope that reaches beyond the last mortal breath any of us will ever draw. We are reminded Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Ultimately, we know where the story is headed, don't we? We know what John is going to do. We know where John takes this. We know where Jesus is going. This is a sign that's pointing to a greater reality. The sign of Jesus calling Lazarus from the tomb is this moment, this sign indicating and pointing to Jesus' own death and resurrection. And at His resurrection and through His resurrection, we have hope in the present moment. The hope that we can only dream of in the end. You see, this theological understanding of John chapter 11 shapes everything else. It puts everything else into a different perspective and into a different light. But it also comes back to John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, Jesus has healed a crippled man who's at the pool of Bethsaida. And the man takes up his bed and he walks. And then Jesus tells the crowd, whoever believes in me has already crossed over from death unto life. So Jesus is declaring that in Him there is nothing to fear about death. He has already taken care of all of that. He has faced death head on, and the future is now. The end is brought into the present. Great theologian, the late Dr. Karl Barth, writes, in place of this fear, the fear that we have of death, in place of this fear, we do not put a substitute faith which postulates a false beyond or a false present, or which effaces the distinction between them. We put hope in God as He revealed Himself in Jesus Christ to be the hope of man. In this hope, fear is defeated. To this hope, we are summoned by the command of God. The hope we have in Christ defeats the fear of death. That's the theological reading here of John 11. Jesus is the means by which all of this comes to pass. He's the embodiment of the commands of God, the purposes of God, and the power of God. He is hope brought to life, brought into the present. New creation right now because of Jesus. And then did you notice that as Jesus concludes, after He said, I'm the resurrection and the life, He ends with a question back to Mary, right? That question is this: do you believe this? Do you believe this? Remember, the signs are there as an invitation to come and believe. To come and believe. That you may believe in God. You may believe in the one He has sent. Will you believe? Will you believe? Jesus asks Martha. And her response, she doesn't just say, yes. She says, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, the deliverer, the Son of God who has come into the world. You are the one we've been waiting for. You are the one we have hoped for. You are. All of this points to John chapter 20, verse 31. After the end, after John has already told the story of the resurrection and about Jesus and Mary encountering one another at the cemetery, John is coming to the end of his writing, and he reflects back and he says, Jesus did many other things that are not written in this book. If they were all written down, all the books in the world couldn't contain them. many other signs. But these are written, why? That you may believe, that you may see the glory of God, that you may know that Jesus is the one who has been sent. What we're saying tonight does not eliminate the day that is yet to come, for the balance of the New Testament speaks to it. There is the day coming when the sky cracks open and there is judgment and there is relief and there is resurrection and there is the end. It's coming. It is there. This doesn't eliminate it by saying, yes, it's all in the here and now and we see it. No, no, no. Rather, what happens when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, it deepens our faith. It anchors our hope all the more, knowing that He will do what He has said He will do. It deepens the expectation of what is coming, bringing that reality into the present as we anticipate that coming day. The sisters of Lazarus asked Jesus, where have you been? And Jesus' response, I have been in the past, I am in the present, I will be in the future, because I am. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. What a moment, church. What a moment. What a hope we have. What a Christ has come to walk among us. Amen. Will you pray with me? Oh, holy God, we are thankful this night to come and bow before you, knowing that you are the resurrection and the life, knowing that there is new life in you, that there is hope in you. So, Father, as it has been prayed through the centuries in the church, use us as instruments of your peace, the proclaimers of your gospel. And where there is despair, may you use us to sow hope. We thank you, O God. We thank you that we can come to you, lament, and hear your tender voice, I am right here where I've always been. And now as Christ hath taught us, we are bold to say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever. Amen. Thank you. Go in peace.